February 26, 1945. Rain hammered the muddy roads of the Rhineland as Obers Heinrich Bauer, technical intelligence officer for the 5th Panzer Army, received an urgent radio message. American forces were advancing with a new tank, not Sherman's, something else, something heavier. The message included coordinates where a German patrol had engaged one of these unknown vehicles near Elsdorf, observing it from concealed positions before withdrawing. Bauer was ordered to reach the frontline units, gather intelligence, interview any crews who had encountered this machine, and report back immediately. Bauer had been analyzing captured Allied equipment since 1942. He'd examined Soviet T-34s, British Churchills, and countless American Shermans. He knew Allied armor intimately, its strengths and fatal weaknesses. The Sherman, in particular, had become almost predictable. Thin frontal armor that an 88mm could penetrate beyond 1,000 meters. A tall silhouette that made it easy to spot. Gasoline engines that burned readily when penetrated. German tank crews had developed tactics specifically around the Sherman's vulnerabilities, but this new tank was different. Initial reports from the front suggested it carried a 90mm gun and had armor thick enough to resist the feared German 88mm at certain ranges. Bauer knew what that meant. The Americans had finally done what German intelligence had warned about for 2 years. They'd built a heavy tank. As Bauer's staff car jolted through the devastated countryside toward the front, he pulled out the preliminary intelligence report. The details were sparse but troubling. Multiple Panther and Tiger crews had engaged these new American tanks over the past 3 days. The engagements had not gone as expected. One Tiger commander reported firing 3 times at one of these machines at approximately 100 meters. 2 hits penetrated, but the American tank had been quickly recovered and repaired. That level of survivability was unusual. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. More disturbing was a report from a Panther crew near the town of Elsdorf. They'd engaged one of the new American tanks at approximately 800 meters with their long-barreled 75mm gun. The shot struck the glacis plate and apparently ricocheted. At 800 meters, a Panther should be able to penetrate a Sherman with certainty. This machine had shrugged off the hit. The American tank had returned fire with its 90mm gun, forcing the German crew to withdraw. The Panther survived, but the German commander's report included a phrase that caught Bauer's attention. "This is not a Sherman. Recommend avoiding engagement, except under favorable conditions." Bauer had read thousands of combat reports during his 3 years of intelligence work. German tank commanders did not write such things lightly. These were men who'd fought across Russia, Africa, and France. Veterans who'd faced T-34s, Matildas, and Grants. When experienced commanders recommended avoiding engagement, it meant they'd encountered something genuinely dangerous. By the time Bauer reached the forward command post near Berendorf, the situation had evolved. The Americans had pushed deeper into the Rhineland. Several more engagements had occurred. Bauer was directed to a field hospital where Lieutenant Karl Hoffmann, commander of a Tiger tank from Heavy Panzer Battalion 507, was recovering from shrapnel wounds. Hoffmann's Tiger had been disabled the previous day during a defensive action outside Elsdorf. His tank had engaged 2 of the new American vehicles. Bauer pulled out his notebook as Hoffmann, his left arm bandaged, recounted the encounter. "We were positioned hull down behind the village outskirts," Hoffmann said. "Good defensive terrain. We spotted the American column approaching. 3 Shermans in front. Predictable. Then we saw them. 2 tanks we didn't recognize. Lower profile than Shermans, but broader, much heavier looking. The gun was massive, clearly a 90mm class weapon." "Range?" Bauer asked. "Approximately 600 meters when I ordered fire. My gunner is one of the best in the battalion. 23 confirmed kills." He aimed for the lead vehicle's frontal glacis, standard Tiger tactic against Shermans. "We use armor-piercing composite rigid rounds. At 600 meters, we can penetrate any Sherman ever built." "What happened?" Hoffmann's expression darkened. "The shot struck the glacis. We saw the impact. The tank kept coming. No penetration. My gunner was shocked. He'd never seen a Sherman take an 88mm round to the glacis without catastrophic damage. "Did you fire again?" "Immediately." Second shot aimed for the turret. This time the Americans stopped and returned fire. The 90mm round struck our frontal armor. At that range it didn't penetrate, but the impact was violent. More violent than a 76mm Sherman round. The Americans clearly had a legitimate tank gun, not the inadequate weapons we'd grown accustomed to. How did the engagement conclude? We fired a third time, aiming for the track assembly. That shot disabled the vehicle. The crew bailed out. But the second American tank had maneuvered to a flanking position. That's when things went wrong. Their gunner was skilled. First round struck our turret ring, jammed the traverse mechanism. Second round penetrated the rear deck. Engine fire, we had to abandon. Bauer took careful notes. Hoffman's account was valuable. The Tiger crew had scored hits, but the engagement had ended with the Tiger disabled and the American tank still operational after repairs. This was not the typical Sherman encounter where a single 88mm round would gut the American tank. Over the next 2 days, Bauer interviewed 7 more German tank commanders who'd engaged these new American machines. The reports were consistent. The American tank was heavily armored, especially on the frontal arc. The 90mm gun was dangerous at combat ranges, capable of penetrating Panther side armor and posing a legitimate threat to Tigers. Most importantly, the tank seemed designed for survivability. Multiple crews reported scoring hits that would have destroyed a Sherman, only to see the American vehicle withdraw and return to action after field repairs. Bauer compiled his findings into a preliminary assessment. The new American tank was designated T26E3 in initial reports, though rumors suggested it would soon receive an official designation. Intelligence had learned the Americans were naming it after General Pershing from the previous war. Bauer's report noted the obvious. The Americans had closed the capability gap, German armor superiority, which had defined tank warfare in France and Russia, was eroding. What Bauer didn't know was how many of these tanks the Americans possessed. That was the critical question. If this was a limited production vehicle, perhaps a few dozen scattered among American armored divisions, it represented a tactical concern but not a strategic threat. But if the Americans were producing these tanks in the hundreds or thousands, the way they produced Shermans, the implications were catastrophic. The answer came 2 weeks later, when Bauer received updated intelligence reports from agents behind American lines. The news was worse than feared. American factories had begun producing the T26E3, now officially designated M26 Pershing, in November 1944. Initial production runs were substantial. The Americans weren't building experimental prototypes, they were building operational combat vehicles at industrial scale. Bauer sat at his makeshift desk in a commandeered farmhouse near the Rhine, reading through the intelligence summary. The Americans had deployed 20 Pershings to Europe in January as part of something called the Zebra Mission, a combat evaluation program. These 20 tanks were serving with the 3rd and 9th Armored Divisions, but behind those 20 tanks, hundreds more were in production. By March, 40 additional Pershings had arrived. By war's end, over 300 would be present in the European theatre. The numbers represented a pattern Bauer had seen before. He thought back to 1943, when he'd examined a captured P-47 Thunderbolt fighter. The American aircraft had been grotesquely large and seemingly crude compared to elegant German fighters. But when Bauer and other technical officers examined the machine, they'd discovered something troubling. The Americans hadn't built a crude aircraft. They'd built a sustainable one. An aircraft designed for mass production, easy maintenance, and operational reliability. The P-47 represented American industrial philosophy made tangible. The Pershing was the same principle applied to armor. Bauer pulled out photographs taken by reconnaissance units. The tank's construction was orthodox. Cast and rolled armor, torsion bar suspension, a relatively conventional layout. Nothing revolutionary. But the Americans had learned from 3 years of tank combat. They'd identified what worked and built it at scale. The armor scheme was practical. 100 millimeters of frontal glacis armor at a good slope, providing effective thickness exceeding 140 millimeters. Turret frontal armor, 76 millimeters, less than a Tiger but still substantial. Side armor thinner, but that was acceptable. The design philosophy prioritized frontal protection, assuming the tank would engage enemies from prepared positions or during advances. The 90mm M3 gun was nearly equivalent to the German 88mm T26 used on Tiger tanks. It could penetrate Panther frontal armor at around 800 meters under ideal conditions, and Panther side armor at any combat range. Against Tigers, the Pershing was roughly comparable. Neither tank had a decisive advantage. Engagements would depend on crew skill, positioning, and tactical circumstances. But that parity was precisely what concerned Bauer. For 3 years, German tanks had maintained qualitative superiority. A Tiger could destroy multiple Shermans before being disabled. A Panther could engage American armor with confidence. The Pershing changed that calculus. American tank crews would no longer be hopelessly outmatched. They'd have a platform capable of fighting German heavy armor on roughly equal terms, and the Americans could produce them. That was the devastating reality. Germany's industrial capacity was collapsing. Allied bombing had disrupted production. Material shortages forced compromises in quality. Training programs for new tank crews had been reduced due to fuel shortages. Meanwhile, American production continued to accelerate. Ford, Chrysler, General Motors, all the massive automotive companies that had built millions of cars, were now building tanks, aircraft, and weapons at a scale Germany couldn't match. Bauer drafted his assessment for higher command. The Pershing represented a maturation of American tank design. It wasn't perfect. Intelligence reports suggested the tank was underpowered, using essentially the same engine as the M4 Sherman, despite weighing 15 tons more. Mobility was reportedly sluggish. The transmission had reliability issues. These were significant tactical limitations, but the Americans would fix those problems. They always did. Bauer had seen it with the Sherman. Early models had been death traps, tall and vulnerable. The Americans responded with improved armor, better guns, wet ammunition storage to prevent fires. They'd iterate and improve. The Pershing would follow the same pattern. Current limitations would be addressed in updated models. Eventually, the Americans would perfect the design. More importantly, the Pershing's existence revealed American strategic thinking. They'd delayed production of a heavy tank for years, focusing on the Sherman because it was easier to produce and transport. The Sherman had won through numbers and operational sustainability, but when the strategic situation demanded a heavier tank, the Americans had one ready. They'd been developing it since 1942. The industrial infrastructure existed to build it at scale. They'd simply waited until the right moment. That kind of strategic patience and industrial depth was beyond Germany's capability. German tank development responded to immediate threats. The Panther and Tiger were reactions to Soviet heavy tanks. They were excellent machines, but they'd been rushed into production with inevitable teething problems. The Americans had developed the Pershing methodically, testing multiple prototypes, refining the design, preparing production facilities. When they finally committed to deployment, the tank worked. Bauer's report concluded with an uncomfortable truth. The Pershing's appearance in February 1945 didn't matter to the war's outcome. Germany was already defeated. The Third Reich's industrial base was shattered. Even if German factories could produce a tank superior to the Pershing, there wasn't enough fuel to operate them, enough trained crews to man them, or enough time to deploy them meaningfully. But the Pershing mattered for what it revealed about American capability. The Americans had built a heavy tank competitive with German armor, and they'd done it while simultaneously producing thousands of Shermans, tens of thousands of trucks, and hundreds of ships and aircraft. The industrial capacity that powered that production would outlast the war. Whatever came after, Whatever political conflicts emerged in the post-war world, the Americans would have the industrial foundation to support their military. Bauer's report was filed with dozens of other intelligence assessments in March 1945. As far as he knew, no one in high command acted on it. The reality it described was too unpalatable. Admitting that American industrial capacity had surpassed German capability would have been tantamount to admitting defeat. Better to maintain the fiction of German technical superiority, even as the evidence piled up. By early April, Bauer's unit had retreated deeper into Germany. American forces crossed the Rhine. The war was clearly ending. Bauer destroyed his notes and intelligence files as his unit prepared to surrender. He wanted no record that might be used to identify collaborators or intelligence sources. The Pershing reports were burned along with everything else. What survived were the combat reports from individual tank crews. German veterans who'd encountered Pershings remembered those engagements clearly. The shock of seeing an American tank that didn't die easily. The realization that American armor was finally dangerous. Those memories would be recorded in post-war interviews and memoirs, creating a scattered historical record of the Pershing's impact. Historians would later debate whether the Pershing could have changed the war's outcome if deployed earlier. Some argued that if hundreds of Pershings had been available for the Normandy invasion or the Battle of the Bulge, American losses would have been significantly lower. Others countered that the Pershing's mobility limitations and the logistical challenge of supporting a heavier tank made earlier deployment impractical. The debate missed the point. The Pershing's significance wasn't whether it could have won battles in 1944. The significance was that the Americans had the industrial capacity and technical sophistication to build it at all, and more. Importantly, to build it while maintaining production of everything else their military needed. Hauptmann Werner Schultz understood this better than most. Schultz commanded a Panther tank in Panzer Division Lehr during the final months of the war. He'd fought from Normandy through the Ardennes offensive and into the Rhineland. By March 1945, his battalion had been reduced to 11 operational Panthers out of an original complement of 76. Fuel shortages meant these remaining tanks could barely maneuver. Ammunition was rationed. Replacement crews were boys of 17, with minimal training. On March 8, 1945, Schultz's platoon was positioned near Remagen, attempting to slow the American advance toward a critical bridge over the Rhine. His orders were to hold the approach roads and prevent American armor from reaching the bridge before German engineers could destroy it. It was a mission everyone knew was futile, but orders were orders. Schultz's Panther was hull down behind a destroyed building, providing cover while allowing his gunner a clear field of fire down the main approach route. Through his commander's periscope, Schultz watched the American column advancing cautiously. Sherman tanks led the advance, followed by infantry in half-tracks. Standard American tactics. Overwhelming force applied methodically. Then Schultz saw them. 4 tanks, unlike any Sherman he'd encountered. Lower, broader, with a distinctive cast turret and a long gun barrel that immediately identified them as heavy weapons. The new American tanks, Schultz had heard rumors but never seen one personally. Gunner, target the lead heavy tank, Schultz ordered. Range approximately 700 meters, armor-piercing. His gunner, Feldwebel Ernst Kramer, was a veteran with 32 confirmed kills. Kramer studied the target through his sight. Herr Hauptmann, that's not a Sherman. Should I aim for the standard kill points? Frontal glacis, center mass, fire, when ready. The Panther's 75mm gun roared. Schultz watched through his periscope as the armor-piercing round struck the American tank's frontal armor. The impact was visible, a bright flash of metal on metal. But the American tank didn't stop. It didn't explode. It didn't even slow down significantly. The crew inside had felt the impact, certainly, but the armor had held. Hit! No penetration, Kramer reported, his voice carrying disbelief. Herr Hauptmann, at this range, we should have penetrated. Fire again. Aim for the turret. The second shot struck the American tank's turret front. Again, no penetration. The American tank stopped, its turret beginning to traverse toward Schultz's position. That 90mm gun was searching for them. "Reverse! Get us out of the kill zone," Schultz ordered. The Panther's driver threw the transmission into reverse. The tank backed deeper into the rubble of the destroyed building just as the American 90mm fired. The round struck the building's remaining wall, showering the Panther with brick and concrete fragments, but causing no damage to the tank itself. Schultz keyed his radio. "All units, American heavy tanks present. The new models. Frontal armor resists 75mm at 700 meters. Recommend flanking engagements only." But flanking engagements required mobility and fuel, neither of which German forces possessed in sufficient quantity. The American tanks continued advancing. Schultz's Panther fired 3 more times, scoring 2 hits on side armor of another American tank, but the engagement was ultimately pointless. The Germans lacked the numbers, fuel, and ammunition to stop the American advance. By the end of the day, American forces had captured the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen intact, creating a bridgehead across the Rhine. Schultz's Panther survived the engagement, but the experience stayed with him. After the war, during interrogation by American intelligence officers, Schultz described the encounter in detail. The American officer, taking notes, asked him a pointed question. "You commanded a Panther, which German propaganda called superior to any Allied tank. You had an excellent crew and good tactical position, yet you couldn't stop 4 American tanks. How do you explain that?" Schultz had thought about this question extensively during the weeks after Germany's surrender. His answer was careful and honest. "The Panther is an excellent tank," he said. "In terms of pure technical capability, it's superior to your Sherman and roughly equivalent to your new Pershing. Our gun can penetrate your armor, your gun can penetrate ours. On paper, it's a fair fight, but war isn't fought on paper." "What do you mean?" "By March 1945, my battalion had 11 operational Panthers. We had fuel for perhaps 3 days of limited operations. Ammunition was rationed to 10 rounds per tank. Our replacement crews had less than 20 hours of training. Your forces had hundreds of tanks, unlimited fuel and ammunition, air superiority, and artillery support. The technical quality of individual tanks became irrelevant." The American officer nodded. "So you're saying industrial capacity decided the outcome, not tank quality?" "Industrial capacity is tank quality," Schultz replied. "A superior tank that can't be produced in sufficient numbers, that can't be maintained in the field, that can't be crewed and fueled and supplied with ammunition, is worthless. Your Pershing isn't better than a Panther in a one-on-one duel, but you built enough of them, and more importantly, you built the entire logistics system to support them. That's what won." This conversation, recorded in American intelligence files, captured the central reality that German commanders understood but could rarely articulate publicly. The Wehrmacht hadn't been defeated by superior Allied tactics or courage. German soldiers had fought skillfully and bravely to the end. They'd been defeated by mathematics. By production numbers, fuel consumption rates, ammunition expenditure calculations, and replacement pool statistics. Oberst Johann Brecht, an analyst in the German Army High Command's Technical Intelligence section, had tried to make this argument as early as 1943. Brecht had compiled comprehensive data on Allied production capacity. His reports included figures on American steel production, aluminum refining capacity, machine tool manufacturing, and industrial workforce size. The numbers were staggering. In 1944 alone, the United States produced approximately 88,000 tanks and self-propelled guns. Germany produced approximately 19,000. American aircraft production exceeded 96,000 units. German production was approximately 40,000. The Americans were building ships, trucks, artillery pieces, and small arms at similar proportional advantages. Brecht's reports went further, analyzing the American industrial system's underlying structure. American factories used standardized production methods. Parts were interchangeable across vehicle types. Maintenance could be performed by mechanics with moderate skill. The entire system was designed for mass production and sustainability. German production, by contrast, emphasized precision engineering, Each tank was built to exacting specifications. Parts often required hand-fitting. Maintenance needed skilled technicians. This approach produced excellent individual vehicles, but couldn't scale to industrial warfare's demands. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Brecht's 1943 report concluded with a stark assessment. Germany cannot win a war of industrial attrition against the United States. Our only path to victory requires forcing a political settlement before American production reaches full capacity. If the war continues past 1944, the material imbalance will become insurmountable. The report was classified and filed. Brecht received no response from high command. Years later, after the war, he learned that his report had been read but dismissed as defeatist. One senior officer had written in the margins, "These are merely numbers. German will and superior training will overcome material disadvantage." But will and training couldn't overcome fuel shortages. By 1945, German armoured units were immobilized for lack of petroleum. The elaborate synthetic fuel program that had sustained operations earlier in the war was collapsing under Allied bombing. Romanian oil fields had been captured by Soviet forces. What little fuel reached frontline units was prioritized for defensive operations. Scholz's Panther battalion experienced this directly. In April 1945, his unit received orders to counterattack American forces near the city of Paderborn. The attack required moving approximately 40 kilometers to the assembly area. Scholz's battalion had 11 Panthers operational. They had enough fuel to move 30 kilometers. The attack was cancelled because the tanks couldn't reach the battlefield. This pattern repeated across the entire German military. Excellent equipment rendered useless by lack of fuel, ammunition, or spare parts. Meanwhile, American forces operated with logistics chains that seemed endless. Fuel trucks followed armoured columns, ensuring tanks never ran dry. Ammunition was abundant. When a tank was damaged, recovery vehicles brought it to field workshops where spare parts were readily available. The Pershing embodied this American approach to warfare. The tank itself was good but not revolutionary. The 90mm gun was comparable to German weapons. The armour was thick but not impenetrable. Mobility was adequate but not exceptional. What made the Pershing dangerous wasn't the individual tank's capabilities. It was the industrial system behind it. Each Pershing was supported by a logistics chain that included fuel production, ammunition manufacturing, spare parts fabrication, crew training programs, and maintenance infrastructure. American factories produced not just tanks, but everything needed to keep those tanks operational. That comprehensive approach to military production was something Germany had never achieved. Lieutenant Friedrich Hartmann learned this lesson painfully in April 1945. Hartmann was a maintenance officer in a panzer repair depot near Kassel. His facility was responsible for repairing damaged German tanks and returning them to service. In theory, it was a critical function. In practice, it had become an exercise in futility. Hartmann's depot had the technical capability to repair almost any damage to German tanks. His mechanics were skilled. The workshop had proper equipment. What they lacked were parts. The German logistics system had collapsed. Parts that should have been available through supply depots didn't exist. Factories that produced replacement components had been bombed or lacked materials. In March 1945, Hartmann's depot had 17 Panthers awaiting repairs. 13 needed new transmissions, 4 needed engine replacements, 2 needed complete track assemblies. The depot had 0 transmissions, 1 engine, and no track assemblies available. The Panthers sat in the repair yard, mechanically deadlined, while frontline units desperately needed every available tank. On April 4, 1945, American forces overran Hartmann's depot. The Americans captured the facility intact, including all 17 Panthers. Hartmann and his men became prisoners of war. During processing, an American officer who spoke German interviewed Hartmann about the depot's operations. "Why were all these tanks sitting here unused?" the American asked, gesturing at the rows of Panthers. "Awaiting parts," Hartmann replied. "We had no replacement transmissions or engines available." How long had they been waiting? Some for over 3 months. The American officer seemed genuinely puzzled. "Your army leaves 17 operational tanks sitting in a depot for months because of parts shortages, while fighting a defensive war?" Hartmann felt the question's implied criticism. It wasn't by choice. The supply system had broken down. Parts weren't available at any depot. We requisitioned through proper channels, but nothing arrived. "What would have happened if you'd sent these tanks back to their units without repairs? They would have broken down within a few kilometers. The transmissions were catastrophically failed. Operating them without replacement would have caused complete mechanical destruction." The American made notes. Later, Hartmann learned that American intelligence was systematically documenting German logistics failures. The 17 deadlined Panthers at Hartmann's depot were added to a growing list of German equipment rendered useless not by combat damage but by systemic supply chain collapse. The irony wasn't lost on Hartmann. The Panthers were excellent tanks, well-designed, powerful, capable. But their technical excellence was meaningless without the industrial support structure to maintain them. The Americans, by contrast, kept their tanks operational through sheer industrial momentum. When a tank needed parts, parts were available. When fuel was required, fuel arrived. The American military machine functioned because every component of the system, from factories to front lines, worked together. This comprehensive integration was what German intelligence officers like Obers Bauer had tried to communicate to higher command. The Pershing wasn't just a tank, it was a symptom of American industrial capability. Behind each Pershing were factories producing ammunition, refineries producing fuel, training centers producing crews, and a logistics network delivering everything needed to the right place at the right time. Germany had lost that industrial competition years before the war's end. By 1943, the outcome was mathematically certain. The only question was how long German forces could resist before the material imbalance became insurmountable. The Pershing's arrival in February 1945 simply illustrated what analysts had known for 2 years. America's industrial capacity had matured into a military advantage Germany couldn't counter. The final statistics were published after the war. Total M26 Pershing production, approximately 2,200 tanks. This number included both wartime production and immediate post-war manufacturing. Of these, only 20 saw combat in World War II during the final 3 months of fighting in Europe. Another 310 had reached Europe by war's end, though most never entered combat. German armor production in 1945, approximately 2,000 tanks and assault guns of all types, produced under increasingly desperate circumstances with declining quality. By April 1945, German factories were producing tanks with simplified armor, substitute materials, and reduced quality control. Some tanks left factories with known mechanical defects because fixing them would have delayed delivery. The contrast illustrated 2 different approaches to military production. Germany prioritized individual unit quality until the system collapsed. America prioritized system reliability, accepting that individual units might be less sophisticated, but ensuring the entire apparatus functioned consistently. Post-war analysis by both German and Allied historians reached similar conclusions. Germany's defeat was inevitable once the United States entered the war and fully mobilized its industrial capacity. The Pershing tank was simply one manifestation of that industrial superiority. Other manifestations included the P-47 Thunderbolt fighter, the Liberty Ship mass production program, and the Manhattan Project's atomic weapons development. In each case, American industrial capability enabled projects that Germany couldn't match, not because German engineers were less skilled, but because American factories, resources, and logistics were operating at a scale Germany couldn't approach. The war had been decided by industrial capacity long before the first Pershing tank rolled off the assembly line. Hans Weber sat in a modest apartment in Frankfurt, Germany, in the spring of 1953, staring at a letter from an American historian. The historian was researching German perspectives on Allied armor and wanted to interview former Panzer officers about their experiences encountering the M26 Pershing. Weber had commanded a Tiger tank in Heavy Panzer Battalion 503 during the war's final months. He'd engaged American Pershings twice, both times near the Remagen bridgehead. Weber hadn't thought about those encounters in years. He'd spent the post-war period rebuilding his life, working as an engineer for a German automotive company. The war belonged to the past, but the historian's letter awakened memories Weber had tried to suppress. He agreed to the interview. The American historian arrived 2 weeks later, a young professor from a university Weber had never heard of. They sat in Weber's small living room, a tape recorder running on the coffee table between them. The historian asked Weber to describe his encounters with the Pershing in as much detail as possible. Weber closed his eyes, remembering. March 9, 1945. His Tiger had been positioned in a defensive line, attempting to contain the American bridgehead at Remagen. American forces were expanding the bridgehead aggressively, pushing German defenders back through sheer weight of numbers and artillery support. We were in a good position, Weber recalled, hull down behind a stone wall, approximately 900 meters from the American advance. We had a clear field of fire. When the American armor appeared, I expected Shermans. We'd fought Shermans for months. We knew how to kill them. But these weren't Shermans? The historian prompted. No. 4 tanks, different silhouette. Lower, heavier. I recognized them from intelligence briefings. The new American heavy tank, the Pershing. What did you do? I ordered my gunner to engage the lead tank. We were using armor-piercing ammunition. At 900 meters, we should have had a reasonable chance of penetration, depending on angle and impact point. Did you penetrate? Weber paused, the memory still sharp. No, the round struck the frontal glacis. We saw the impact, but the American tank didn't stop. It kept advancing. My gunner fired again, this time at the second tank. Another frontal hit, no penetration. At that point, I realized we were in trouble. Why? Because at 900 meters, a Tiger should dominate any Allied tank. Our 88mm gun was designed to engage and destroy heavy armor at that range, but we'd fired twice, scored 2 hits, and achieved nothing. The Americans returned fire. Their 90mm gun was accurate. The first round passed close enough that we felt the displacement. The second struck our position, damaging the stone wall we were using for cover. What did you do? We withdrew. There was no point continuing the engagement. We couldn't penetrate their frontal armor at that range, and they had numerical superiority. Staying would have meant losing the Tiger for no strategic gain. The historian made notes. Did you engage Pershings again? Once more, 3 days later. Closer range, approximately 500 meters. This time we were more successful. We achieved 1 penetration on a Pershing's side armor when it maneuvered to avoid artillery fire. The crew bailed out. We disabled the tank. But the Americans had 7 more tanks supporting that vehicle, including 3 other Pershings. We destroyed one, but the tactical situation didn't change. They continued advancing, and we continued retreating. The historian asked the obvious question. In your professional judgment, was the Pershing a better tank than the Tiger? Weber considered carefully. In a one-on-one duel, under ideal conditions, the Tiger had advantages. Better gun, comparable armor, good crew training. But war isn't one-on-one duels under ideal conditions. The Pershing had adequate armor to resist our gun at longer ranges. Its gun could penetrate us at combat ranges. And most importantly, the Americans had many Pershings. They had fuel for them. They had ammunition. They had replacement crews. By March 1945, we had none of those things. So, industrial capacity mattered more than individual tank quality. Industrial capacity was everything, Weber said flatly. A Tiger was useless without fuel. A Panther was useless without ammunition. Our most advanced tanks sat abandoned on roadsides because we couldn't move them or operate them. The Americans kept their tanks running. That's why they won. This conversation, preserved in the historian's archives, captured what many German veterans understood but rarely discussed publicly. The Wehrmacht had been defeated not by inferior training or courage, but by mathematics, by production numbers and logistics calculations that were never in Germany's favor. Obers Heinrich Bauer, the intelligence officer who'd first compiled reports on the Pershing in February 1945, survived the war and returned to civilian life as a technical consultant. In 1957, he published a memoir titled Intelligence and Illusion, a German officer's perspective on Allied material superiority. The book received limited attention in Germany, but was widely read by American and British military historians. Bauer's central argument was that German military leadership had systematically ignored intelligence about Allied industrial capacity because accepting the truth would have required acknowledging that Germany couldn't win. It was psychologically easier to believe in German technical superiority and tactical excellence than to face the mathematical certainty of industrial defeat. I filed dozens of reports documenting Allied production advantages, Bauer wrote. Each report was acknowledged and filed. None resulted in strategic changes. The leadership preferred comforting myths to uncomfortable truths. They believed willpower could overcome material disadvantage. They were wrong. Bauer's memoir included a detailed section on the Pershing tank. He described his February 1945 investigation, the combat reports he'd collected, and the conclusions he'd reached. The Pershing represented American industrial maturity. It wasn't a revolutionary design, but it didn't need to be. It was adequate for its purpose, and the Americans could produce it in sufficient numbers to matter. The Pershing proved that American industry had learned from 3 years of tank combat, Bauer wrote. They'd identified what worked and built it reliably. The tank had flaws, it was underpowered. The transmission was problematic, but those flaws could be addressed in subsequent models. The foundation was sound. Germany, by contrast, was producing increasingly desperate designs with declining quality. We'd lost the industrial competition years earlier. The Pershing simply made that loss visible. The post-war period saw extensive technical analysis of German and Allied armor. Engineers from multiple nations examined captured equipment, comparing design philosophies and manufacturing approaches. The conclusions were consistent. German tanks represented sophisticated engineering pushed to operational limits. Allied tanks, particularly American designs, represented practical engineering optimized for mass production and sustainability. The Pershing's post-war career illustrated American design philosophy's long-term benefits. The tank was quickly superseded by improved variants. The M26 pattern added a new engine and improved transmission, addressing the Pershing's mobility problems. The M47 and M48 patterns further refined the design. By the 1950s, the American armor fleet consisted of tanks that traced their lineage directly back to the Pershing's basic layout. This evolutionary development was possible because the Pershing's foundation was sound. The torsion bar suspension, cast turret design, and 90mm gun provided a platform that could be upgraded incrementally. American engineers didn't need to completely redesign their tanks every few years. They refined and improved proven designs. Germany's post-war tank development, when the nation eventually rebuilt its military, followed a different path. Having learned from wartime experiences, German engineers in the 1950s designed the Leopard tank using many principles that had characterized American designs. Operational reliability, ease of maintenance, and production efficiency became priorities. The lessons of industrial warfare had been absorbed. The Pershing saw extensive combat in Korea from 1950 to 1953, where it proved effective against Soviet-built T-34 tanks used by North Korean and Chinese forces. The Pershing's 90mm gun could penetrate the T-34 at any combat range, while the T-34's 85mm gun struggled against the Pershing's frontal armor. The kill-loss ratios favored American forces heavily. Korean War veterans' accounts of Pershing operations revealed the same pattern that had characterized World War II. The tank itself was good, but not exceptional. What made it effective was the comprehensive support system. American Pershings operated with reliable logistics, adequate fuel and ammunition, and maintenance support that kept them operational. North Korean and Chinese armor, by contrast, often suffered from supply problems similar to those that had plagued German forces in 1945. Major Robert Simmons commanded a Pershing platoon in Korea during heavy fighting in the summer of 1950. His after-action reports documented engagements with T-34 tanks near the Pusan perimeter. In one engagement, Simmons' platoon of 4 Pershings encountered 7 T-34s in a valley engagement at ranges between 600 and 1,000 meters. The T-34 is a good tank, Simmons wrote in his report, well-designed, reliable, produced in huge numbers by the Soviets. But in that engagement, we destroyed 5 T-34s and damaged the other 2 without loss. Not because our crews were better trained, though they were well trained. Not because the Pershing was vastly superior, though it had advantages. We won because we had ammunition for sustained firing, our tanks were mechanically reliable, and we had radio communication allowing coordinated action. The North Koreans were brave and fought hard, but they were operating with limited ammunition, mechanical problems, and poor communication. Simmons' observation echoed what German officers had learned in World War II. Individual equipment quality mattered less than systemic capability. A tank was only as effective as the logistics, training, and support structure behind it. The Americans had built that comprehensive system. Their opponents, whether German in 1945 or North Korean in 1950, hadn't. By 1951, the Pershing was being phased out of frontline service, replaced by the improved M26 pattern. But many Pershings continued serving in reserve units and with Allied forces. The tank's basic design proved durable enough to remain relevant for years after its initial deployment. Some Pershings served into the 1960s with smaller militaries that received them through military assistance programs. The tank's longevity validated the American design approach. Build something good enough, reliable enough, and producible enough to matter, then refine it incrementally. This philosophy characterized American military procurement for decades after World War II. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. In 1972, military historian Samuel Morrison published a comprehensive analysis of World War II tank development titled Steel and Strategy, the Industrial Dimension of Armored Warfare. Morrison's work included extensive interviews with German and American veterans, technical analysis of various tank designs, and statistical examination of production and operational data. Morrison's conclusion was unequivocal. The M26 Pershing was not the best tank of World War II. That distinction arguably belongs to the German Tiger II or the Soviet Joseph Stalin II, both of which had superior armor and firepower. But the Pershing was the most important American tank because it demonstrated that American industry could produce heavy armor, competitive with the best Axis designs, and do so while maintaining production of everything else the military needed. The Pershing proved American industrial maturity. That proof mattered more than the specific capabilities of any individual tank. Morrison interviewed Obers Bauer for the book. By 1972, Bauer was in his 70s, living in retirement in Bavaria. He reflected on his wartime intelligence work with the perspective of 3 decades. "We knew we were losing by 1943, Bauer told Morrison. The intelligence was clear. The production numbers, the logistics analysis, all pointed to inevitable defeat. But knowing and accepting are different things. German leadership couldn't accept that our technical excellence and tactical skill wouldn't overcome material disadvantage. They kept believing, against all evidence, that we could win through superior will." "When did you personally accept that Germany would lose?" Morrison asked. "When I examined the Pershing reports in February 1945, Bauer said. "Not because the Pershing was invincible. It wasn't. But because it existed at all. The Americans had developed a heavy tank, put it into production, and deployed it to Europe, all while maintaining their existing production of Shermans and everything else. That demonstrated industrial capacity we couldn't match. At that moment, I understood the war was over. Not in a tactical sense, we'd fight for 3 more months, but in a strategic sense. The Americans had won the industrial war, and that was the only war that ultimately mattered. The Pershing tank's legacy extended beyond its direct combat role. It represented a turning point in American military development. Before the Pershing, American armor doctrine had emphasized medium tanks supported by tank destroyers. The Sherman was built to exploit breakthroughs, not fight enemy armor directly. Tank destroyers would handle German heavy tanks, while Shermans provided mobile firepower and infantry support. This doctrine worked adequately in North Africa and Italy, where German armor was present but not dominant. It collapsed in Northwest Europe, where Panthers and Tigers were concentrated in numbers that overwhelmed American tank destroyer battalions. The Sherman proved inadequate against German heavy armor. American tankers died in large numbers during Normandy and the Battle of the Bulge. The Pershing's development forced American military leadership to confront this doctrinal failure. Heavy tanks weren't just needed for breakthrough operations. They were needed for sustained combat against peer enemies with sophisticated armor. This realization shaped post-war American tank development. The Patton series, the M60, and eventually the M1 Abrams all reflected lessons learned from the Pershing's development and deployment. German influence on post-war tank design was minimal, despite the technical sophistication of tanks like the Panther and Tiger. The reason was simple. German tanks had lost. Their technical excellence hadn't prevented strategic defeat. Military planners worldwide studied German failures as cautionary examples, not successes to emulate. The Pershing, by contrast, represented a winning approach: build competent equipment, produce it reliably, support it comprehensively, and employ it in numbers that make individual losses manageable. This philosophy characterized American military procurement through the Cold War and beyond. It wasn't exciting or innovative, but it was effective. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. On a rainy afternoon in April 1989, a small ceremony took place at the United States Army Armor Museum at Fort Knox, Kentucky. A restored M26 Pershing was being dedicated as a permanent exhibit. Among the attendees were several World War II veterans who'd served in Pershing crews during the final months of the European War. One veteran, former Sergeant James O'Connor, who'd been a gunner in a Pershing with the 3rd Armored Division, gave a brief speech. O'Connor was 70 years old, his hands shaking slightly as he held his notes. "This tank saved my life," O'Connor said, gesturing at the restored Pershing. "I'd served in Shermans before transferring to a Pershing crew in February '45. The Sherman was a good tank, but we all knew it couldn't match German heavy armor. When we got the Pershing, we finally felt like we had a fighting chance. Not superiority, just a chance. That's all we needed." O'Connor described an engagement near Paderborn in April 1945. His Pershing had encountered 2 Panther tanks at approximately 700 meters. "We traded shots," O'Connor recalled. "They hit us, twice, both times on the frontal armor. Both rounds bounced. We hit one of them in the turret, penetrated, knocked it out. The second Panther withdrew. In a Sherman, we'd have been dead. The Pershing's armor saved us." After the ceremony, O'Connor walked around the restored tank, running his hand along the thick frontal armor. A journalist asked him if he thought the Pershing was the best tank of World War II. O'Connor laughed. "Best? I don't know about best, but it was good enough when it mattered. That's what counted." That phrase, "good enough when it mattered," captured the Pershing's true significance. It wasn't the most heavily armored tank, it wasn't the most mobile. It wasn't the most powerful, but it was adequate for its purpose, and it arrived when American forces needed it, backed by an industrial system that could produce and support it. The contrast with German experience was stark. Germany had produced tanks that were technically superior on paper. The Tiger II had better armor and a more powerful gun than the Pershing. The Panther had better mobility. But these advantages became meaningless when the tanks couldn't be fueled, couldn't be maintained, couldn't be produced in sufficient numbers. Military effectiveness wasn't about peak performance. It was about sustained capability. The side that could keep more tanks running, more aircraft flying, more soldiers supplied, would eventually win. The Pershing embodied that principle. It was American industrial philosophy made tangible in steel and gunpowder. In the final analysis, the Pershing tank's importance lay not in what it destroyed, but in what it represented. It demonstrated that by 1945, American industry had matured to the point where it could produce heavy armor, competitive with the best enemy designs, while simultaneously maintaining production across every other category of military equipment. German intelligence officers like Bauer and technical experts like Scholz had recognized this immediately, but recognition came too late. By the time the Pershing appeared on European battlefields, Germany's industrial capacity was shattered beyond repair. The war was already lost. The Pershing was simply the proof, delivered in 100mm armor plate and 90mm shells, that American industrial power had overwhelmed German technical excellence. It was a lesson that would shape military thinking for generations. In modern warfare, sustained industrial capacity matters more than peak performance. Reliability beats sophistication. Numbers defeat quality when the numbers are large enough. German veterans who'd faced the Pershing understood this. Years after the war, in quiet conversations and memoirs, they acknowledged what their leadership had refused to accept. They'd been defeated not by American soldiers. German veterans respected their opponents' courage and competence, but by American factories, by the steel mills of Pittsburgh, the assembly lines of Detroit, and the refineries of Texas. The Pershing tank was simply one product of that industrial juggernaut. But it was enough. It proved that America could build heavy armor. It proved that American industry could support sustained military operations at a scale Germany couldn't match. And most importantly, it proved that the war's outcome had never been in doubt once America's industrial capacity reached full mobilization. That was the uncomfortable truth that Heinrich Bauer had tried to communicate in his February 1945 intelligence report. The truth that was filed and ignored because it contradicted comfortable myths about German superiority. The truth that became undeniable as American forces, supported by endless streams of equipment and supplies, ground through Germany's last defenses. The M26 Pershing wasn't just a tank, it was mathematics made manifest. It was the cold calculation of industrial warfare, proving that in sustained, modern conflict, the side with greater production capacity, better logistics, and more comprehensive industrial mobilization would ultimately prevail, regardless of individual equipment quality or tactical excellence. And in World War II, that side was the United States. The Pershing was simply the armor-plated proof.